Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Bright Shift podcast. Before we start, I would like to invite you to ask yourself this question: who are you? Or how do you usually define yourself? What criteria do you choose to answer this question? Chances are most of us use notions such as our gender, nationality, job titles, degrees, our achievements, or shortcomings to define ourselves. But today on this episode, we're going to question and rethink how we define ourselves and challenge our assumptions about our sense of identity. Doing that, we will be looking at this concept through the lens of Jiddu Krishnamurti, one of the greatest philosophers and spiritual teachers of the 20th century. Jiddu Krishnamurti spent his entire life traveling the world, teaching, writing many books, and speaking to large and small groups of people and individuals. His teachings are deeply transformative and revolutionary on a both spiritual and psychological level. Joining me on this discussion are Dr. Radhika Herzberger and Mr. Kamal Thakur. Dr. Radhika Herzberger is a writer, an educationist, and a scholar in Sanskrit and Indology, with a PhD in Indology from the University of Toronto. In 2013, the government of India honored her by awarding her the Padma Shri Award, which is the fourth highest civilian award for her contributions to the fields of literature and education. She is a trustee of the Krishnamurti Foundation of India. Her major educational engagement is to define humanistic studies based on the relevance of Krishnamurti teachings. Our next guest is Mr. Kamal Thakur. After finding himself drawn to the teachings of Jiddu Krishnamurti, Kamal joins the J. Krishnamurti's Foundation in India in 2004. Prior to that, he was working in the corporate world for 30 years. He has worked at the Krishnamurti's Foundation and was involved in the huge setup of the foundation in Varanasi. In 2008, he joins the Kolkata Center of the Jiddu Krishnamurti's Foundation and has been working there ever since. He's actually the person who has made this interview possible. So a huge thank you to Mr. Kamal. Dr. Radhika and Mr. Kamal, welcome to the Bright Shift podcast. I'm very glad to have you both here.
Hi, everybody who is listening to this podcast. Krishnamurti is not a very easy person to penetrate. So we're trying to make it, all of us are trying to make it as approachable as possible and as close to familiar concepts. And then through the familiarity of the concepts, penetrate to the depth of his thinking.
First of all, I want to thank Laila because this is a marvelous opportunity that she has given us. And I think the other big thing is that, like people like me and Radhika ji, of course, she has been associated with people who are close to Krishnamurti. But unlike Radhika ji, I stumbled on Krishnamurti. And I'm hoping that somehow the beauty that, one sees in all that work, I think it's amazing. But if one has the patience to penetrate, then it's so beautiful. I'm hoping that the audience will somehow find it sooner or later. Thank
you. Actually, this is an opportunity for all of us to learn more about Jiddu Krishnamurti and his philosophy. We are going to have a dialogue about the concept of identity based on J. Krishnamurti's teachings. And this is a concept that I'm intending to talk about over and over again on this podcast from different perspectives. I think it's such an important topic because we all tend to relate to this world according to what we have based our sense of identity on. J. Krishnamurti's outlook tells us to drop the idea of any sort of identification with things such as our family background, our job titles, our nationality, and etc. And according to him, we should live in this world without any sense of identification. Could you please describe why he recommended this approach?
I think I'd like to begin with the idea of fairness, which is a fundamental human moral feeling that it's found in religions, it's found in law, it's found, even little children say that's not fair. So, and I think a clear example for the need to drop one's identifications is that it prevents, if we have a strong sense of identification, then it prevents fairness. So that is fundamental. And so Krishnamurti, however, thought that you can't drop your sense of identification. He didn't preach it, drop it, or don't be unfair, don't, but rather he wanted to find out why we are unfair and find the cause of the unfairness, and then in drawing out the causes of why you are unfair, you will automatically drop it. Mm-hmm. So observation has a fundamental role in all this. A clear example for the need to drop one's identifications is that it prevents, if we have a strong sense of identification, then it prevents fairness. So that is fundamental. And so Krishnamurti, however, thought that you can't drop your sense of identification. He didn't preach it, drop it, or don't be unfair, don't, but rather he wanted to find out why we are unfair and find the cause of the unfairness, and then in drawing out the causes of why you are unfair, you will automatically drop it. Observation has a fundamental role in all this. So instead of saying, preaching, don't do this, don't do that, because that's a kind of investigation stopper. Rather, he said, find out why you are being unfair in the present situation, why you are wearing the prism, a spectacle of prejudice when you approach this problem. Identification, in a sense, turns out to be a sort of prejudice. Not always, but it can.
And psychologically, we tend to constantly identify with different emotions and thoughts as well, such as identifying with our weaknesses, disappointments, strengths, fears. And if we learn to stop identifying with such feelings and thoughts, we can perhaps experience a great sense of relief and liberation. So, what are your thoughts on the therapeutic effects of this outlook?
Well, I think identification makes one conflicted. It tends to be part of the conflicts that human beings suffer. And conflict can be a source of depression and dissatisfaction, not only with oneself, but with to the things to which one is related, like one's family, one's children. And that is why it is important to observe the self-inaction rather than start with a sense of identity, because identification blocks inquiry. Identification, you say, I am angry, I'm an aggressive woman, and then what? It doesn't lead to any investigation of why I am an angry woman. So it's a conclusion. And Krishnaji didn't think one should start with conclusions, but inquiry is the basis of working oneself through conflict and weakness. So the moment I say, I am an angry woman, or I am a stupid woman, then it's a full stop. It's like a full stop.
Interesting.
So I don't know whether that may, but instead one should see if I am being stupid or arrogant or angry, instead of identifying and calling yourself an angry woman, why not pause and look at what is going through my mind, so that it isn't a judgment, a final judgment on oneself, which makes us very unhappy. And one does the same thing with other people, one's children, one's mother-in-law, which it can be a source of conflict.
Yes. So We often tend to identify with our emotions. And for example, if I say I'm angry, I tend to think that I am that anger. Whereas it seems that J. Krishnamurti is encouraging us to distinguish between that label and who we are.
Yes.
And in that process, we can see the therapeutic effect of this outlook.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. One can see that one doesn't label oneself, and in labeling oneself, one makes oneself into an object.
That's
And
right.
stops further inquiry into why I am the way I am, why this emotion has arisen. And also one condemns oneself. And so that sense of inferiority, that sense of not being at home in the world, in a present situation, continues.
And most societies in today's world are culturally very much achievement oriented, in a sense that they are conditioning people to base their sense of self worth or their entire identity on how much money they make, how much they have achieved in their life, or on their status quo. And this way of thinking can lead to many challenges for the 21st century human being. And at times, this way of thinking can be the underlying cause for depression and frustration for many. I'd like to hear about your outlook on this issue.
Well, one to impose a one-pointed agenda, say making money on the entire population on as universal, is itself ignores the complexity of human nature, of the talents that we have, of the many-sided accomplishments that are possible in this world. And so that's one thing. Second thing is that in doing this, we ignore our responsibilities. In making money, we ignore our responsibilities to the social order. For instance, there's a lot of inequality in the world today. And what is our responsibility to this inequality in our own societies? So perhaps we should put aside this one-pointed agenda that the world is imposing on us and think of the social good as a whole. Because I think that is very important. And also, if you think of yourself as in terms of making money and measure your success in terms of how much money you've made, it can lead to a lot of, as you say, depression, a lot of sense of inadequacy, because not every human being can make money, and to judge every human being by the amount of money they can make is very limited criteria. After all, there's goodness, there's truth, there's beauty, there's artists, and you may struggle and you may not. You have, as a human being, you have a right to be recognized as a part of human nature and as valuable. The self-worth is important, intrinsic to human nature.
Absolutely. And I would like to add that this philosophy is not encouraging anyone to have no goals or dreams in life, or not to aim to have any achievements. It seems that it is rather inviting us to distinguish between who we are and what we identify ourselves with. So it's like I may work hard to achieve a goal, but I have to keep in mind that I am not the goal. And my sense of self can remain intact by the consequences of my effort. Could you elaborate on this concept as well for us a little bit?
Yes, in a sense, um, uh, my sense of myself is not singular. I have my nature is multiple. And in focusing on one unitary goal, I am, in a sense, excluding a great part of my being and talent. And it is covered over by social expectations, by parental expectations. And so there's a lot of multiplicity of expectations, and which leads to a lot of confusion. And if you clarify that, then the goals that are authentic to your being can be pursued without struggle.
I see.
Without struggle. So that there's a distinction between authentic goals and imposed goals. And a lot of goals are imposed by family, society, fashion, all that. So to drop those, to distinguish between what is authentic to me and what is imposed, the expectations that are imposed, is fundamental to leading a good life.
That was a really great point that you just mentioned, that most of our goals are actually imposed on us and we are not conscious of it.
We're not conscious of it. Because we are told, because the way parents bring up children, schools bring up children is do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that, rather than saying, you're being naughty, find out why. So that it becomes an investigation rather than you don't lay down rules as automatic. And then there should be a kind of kindness that to oneself also. I feel that in investigating one's goals and one's purpose in life, one should be kind to oneself.
Can I add something on, something that just before it goes, into the background, you were asking about about the therapeutic aspect.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think one of the things I think it's important, for all of us, actually, listeners, everybody, is to realize that if the emphasis on inquiring into the truth, into seeing what is, into seeing things as they are, then it can become therapeutic, because then it does something to dismantle some of the things that have become accumulated conditionings, etc. I'll give you a small example, Ella. I think it is very interesting because when I used to be in a corporate career, and I remember going to Bombay, and I used to spend time with my sister, and they were watching videos on Krishnamurti. And at that time, I was very much in the in the mold of being a corporate person. And I sort of wondered as to what this man is saying. He's actually somehow or the other it just didn't gel at all. I was saying maybe he doesn't talk about God in the right frame, etc., etc. But 4 years later, when I had withdrawn from a corporate life, and therefore the space had come, I was watching the same video and then seeing things, as they were coming, the listening changed. So I think the point I want to make is that it becomes therapeutic if, we don't constantly protect the filters from which we see. So, the filters become our problem, our own filters.
Yes.
So that's the point I wanted to make before you go ahead.
That's a great point. And thank you for mentioning that, because sometimes our understanding of what can be therapeutic and what cannot be can be limited. And sometimes just developing a certain awareness can be very much therapeutic. Another question can arise here, and that is, if we are not supposed to identify our sense of self with such things as discussed earlier, so according to J. Krishnamurti, what are we? How is that sense of self defined based on his philosophy?
If I may answer that question, I think Krishnamurti had this notion of an authentic self, of the right path for you as an individual. And science also supports that, because we, in a sense, have a unique DNA. No two people have the same DNA. Each individual is unique. But as he pointed out, he had a definition of individuality. We are really not individuals. We are social constructs. As I said, as we discussed earlier, we are, our goals, our understanding of ourselves is imposed. A lot of it is imposed by society, by parents, by education. So if you take this idea of the beginning of self-knowledge as inquiry rather than summing up what I am as a conclusion, then you can uncover, discard what is not authentic and find out what is authentic. I think that is a very important process, especially today when the world is moving so fast.
So it's more like a journey that we should discover ourselves in. It seems like that.
Discover ourselves and one of the preconditions of discovering ourselves is slowing down the mind, because otherwise we just look at ourselves as we look at a book. We make ourselves into objects, and the book table of contents is sort of what we are. We sort of sum up. But rather he felt that you don't make yourself into a book. Don't come to it with the sort of set conclusions and labels and titles, but come with an observation, awareness.
So we can conclude that if we are defined by such notions, such as our age, gender, or our psychological attributes, we are kind of limiting ourselves in a box. Yes. And we are way beyond all of these notions. And when it comes to J. Krishnamurti's philosophy, there is another concept that I think it's very important, and that is the difference between the observing oneself and thinking about oneself. Would you mind describing the difference between these two, observing oneself and thinking about oneself?
To think about oneself is to think in terms of conclusions, in terms of labels, conclusions. I am this, I want to be that. But to observe without condemning, judging, the passing thought. I think that Krishnamurti recommended that we slow down the mind. Because you cannot observe the mind if you want to observe it not in terms of summing up, in terms of what you described as thinking about oneself. But if one wants to to observe oneself in awareness, then one must slow down the mind. And in his early works, he talked about the mind is like a fast-moving machine. That there's thought piled on thought feeling piled on thought feeling. And how do you slow it down? And to slow it down, he suggested that you write down. I think this is very early in 46 and all. You write down your thoughts. Every day, write down automatically what you think. And in time, it will slow down and you can observe the fleeting thought.
That's interesting. Many psychologists are recommending that technique to, write down your thoughts and emotions. And so this brings my next question, which is, it's almost related to my next question. How can we practice cultivating this sense of self that is free from various identifications? Are there any methods or techniques that you can share with us?
Yes. Okay.
So begin by saying, I think this is something very important, because Krishnaji is to always, urge us, to understand that we are learners. I think the reason that is important is that he wanted everybody to go into the teaching in person, in depth, and discover, for himself or herself. Because sometimes, what happens is that we tend to, look for people and we just listen for words. We don't actually, go into the depth of that whole teaching. So that was something which he, encouraged people to actually, really go into the depth of things. So I'd like to give one example, it came to my mind because when we have the annual book fair here in Kolkata, every year we have the book fair. It's a very popular event here, and lots of people come. And I remember that year when we had put up a particular Krishnamurti poster, and the quote said, the quote was that we are talking here about cessation of the self, not self-improvement.
Mm-hmm.
So that was telling me. Mm-hmm. And when visitors would come and they would say, well, this is ridiculous. You're talking about, how can he be talking about cessation of the self? Then what happens to me?
Yes.
So I think it was very interesting, and for anybody, for me as well, for a very, very long time, it just did not click. But if it sort of, I think Krishnaji actually says that if you look at the self for what it is, you will find that it is only essentially accumulation. It is hurt, it is fear, it's anxiety, it's identification. I am so and so, I belong to this religion or nationality. So he said that, if you can see that, then it will perhaps a process of dissolution might happen, dissolution of the self, and then you really begin to see. So that I find is very, very telling, because for Krishnaji, I think that's the other thing. Seeing, was basically action. So if you can see things as they are, if you can see what is, that is action. And, just to touch earlier on the earlier point about what we are talking about, observing and thinking, I think that's very related to this, because when thinking is going on, it's basically from a platform of the past, essentially. It's essentially arising from a platform of the past. Whereas observation has no background whatsoever, awareness or observation. So similarly, when Krishnaji talked about seeing, that became a very, very important part of my learning, to say, well, explore that, because it's not me seeing. It's not me seeing something. It's actually just seeing, without any filters. So I think that was something that, it's very relevant for this particular discussion. I'd just like to quote something. I'd just like to share this interesting quote from Krishnaji, where he says, when there is only the organism without the self, then perception, both visual and non-visual, can never be distorted. There is then only seeing what is.
Wow.
Now, so essentially, I'm just giving my own thinking on that, is that what he meant was that if you are able to see without the filters of your own conclusions, our own identifications, our own hurts and anxieties, then you can see things as they are. And then essentially seeing things as they are is the only way forward. Then you can go beyond, So coming back to the question, is that, you asked about whether there is any practice. So for these reasons, I think there is no such method or system or practice. I think one has to simply get so intense about the whole process of, trying to understand what he's saying about seeing, observing, awareness, that becomes the action, basically. And no practice, no method.
I see. So my understanding, based on what you have mentioned so far, is that if we look at things as they are, without having some previous judgment about them, then we are really seeing them. And the next thing was that if we start to develop the awareness of dropping these different identifications, then gradually our authentic self will start to appear.
I'd like to read, because Laila asked this question about method. And I'd like to continue that, because I have a quotation. This is early Krishnamurti. He said, I suggested that to slow down the mind in order to examine the thought feeling, because awareness of thought feeling process, you should write down every thought feeling. If one wishes to understand, for example, a machine of high revolution, one has to slow it down, not stop it. For then it becomes merely a dead matter. but make it turn gently, slowly, to study its structure, its movement. Likewise, if we wish to understand our mind, we must slow down our thinking, not put a stop to it. Slow it down in order to study it, to follow it to its fullest extent. So this idea of writing down is a sort of a method, because
Yes.
thinking about the self, you can just spin ideas. What is new comes from the senses. So stilling the mind, slowing it down, makes the new come into as an entry into consciousness.
Sure. So we should consider that as well as one of the ways to
In the
get there.
early in the 40s, this is my quotation is from 46, pre-war, 44, 45. When he and to children also here he said, observe, look at a lizard, for instance, the way it clings to the wall. Look, so that looking, the senses are very important.
And Dr. Radhika, you talked about the concept of oneness earlier, and I want to talk about that a little bit more. So, to live life without a sense of identification can lead us to a space where there is equality and no one is inferior or superior to the others. And this can create a sense of oneness amongst us. Many spiritual teachers have encouraged us to infuse our lives with such concepts. Could you please explain how we can apply J. Krishnamurti's concepts of going beyond identities to the concept of equality and oneness? I know you have talked about it a little bit already, but if possible, could you please tell us more?
The residue of slowing the mind and coming to terms, as Mr. Kamal said, with what is, leaves, that's a fundamental silence. So a slow mind has between thoughts a kind of silent space, and that can be communicated to others. And that's the unity born, silence born of unity, that is the product of silence, unity with other human beings, with nature, with one's environment. So if there is that residue of silence, which is growing larger and larger through constant awareness, then that can be communicated, and that can form the basis of a community, a union of silence, silent human beings, maybe, who are not judgmental, who are not, who treat each other as equals.
That's
Am
beautiful.
I right, Kamal Bhai? Is that
absolutely, yes. Radhika? Yeah, absolutely.
And in general, J. Krishnamurti has advised developing the ability of questioning and breaking through the mechanical thinking and the centuries of conditioning. Could you expand on this topic a little more and tell us what Krishnamurti's opinion are on the matter of dropping the mechanical thinking?
Well, so dropping. Yeah, you want to say something, Kamal?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
I think before I go into that, Leila, I think I just remembered something that might be relevant to some of the things we were discussing. There was a physicist called Fritjof Capra, and there is a very nice book by him. I think something to do with meeting people of uncommon wisdom, and among them was, of course, Krishnamurti. And he talked about a talk which he attended somewhere, I think in Italy, where Krishnamurti was talking about, going beyond thought and, identification, all these sort of things. And he was totally foxed. And he went home and he would talk to his wife. His wife was Jacqueline. He would talk to her and he said that, I just can't understand what he's saying. So next day he had the opportunity. He happened to meet Krishnamurti after the talk. And he asked him, you are suggesting that I go beyond thought and do all this. And how do I do all that? If I have to become a scientist, I can't just function like that. So he said something very interesting. He said that drop everything else, just create your being or your functioning on the ground that you are a human being. Everything else, drop everything else. And initially it just did not strike him, but then when he went home and talked to his wife, and he said that, in just 10 minutes, his whole problem was resolved. Because it means that you are working from a ground which has no fragmentation whatsoever, no division. It's only as a human being. So whatever you do, you are never looking at, whether it's going to benefit X or Y. You're looking at it, whether it's going to benefit humanity. So it's always in terms of right action. So he records that interview very well. And I thought it's very telling in the context of identification. And you mentioned about the other issue about mechanical thinking. I think, all of us, wherever we live, I think we've all been conditioned by our environment, nationality, religion, beliefs, our suffering, our wars, everything. And, and that is the ground from which we act consciously, sometimes mostly unconsciously, and sometimes consciously. So I think Krishnamurti often used to say that the only way forward is to see the conditioning and see the danger for what it is, actually. See the danger of conditioning. And it's like, if you realize that you are on the edge of a precipice, then you move away. So I think the important thing that he was trying to stress is that just being aware. I think more often than not, we don't see our conditioning. We don't see it as a mechanic. So the whole looking is actually distorted. And so we are functioning from a base that is actually false, basically on false ground. And he made another interesting point. He said that you can't do anything about this through thought, through any other practice or method, because thought is part of conditioning. Conditioning, thought, self, all that go together. The only way forward is being aware. So to make sure that one is aware of it, not be self-obsessed, but be self-observant.
I like that quote a lot. Not to be self-obsessed, but to be self-observant. Okay. That was a beautiful way of explaining it. Dr. Radhika, did you want to add to this concept of mechanical thinking?
Well, a lot of thinking is automatic. One is constantly, thought processes are going on, even when one is asleep. The thought. And if one walks down the street, one's preoccupations are what occupy us, not the surrounding nature so in a sense, it is self-absorption. It is self-absorption and mechanical because it comes from a conditioned source. It can be humming of a favorite tune, or it can be my worry about losing my property or my quarrel with my children. And you just go spin round and round, and there is no attention. You see, I think attention is an important concept in Krishnamurti. How attention is something that, unlike, is not only just a focus. For most educators and all, it comes out of a certain focus, but there is a kind of wide-lensed attention that takes in the immediate as well as the peripheries. I think that is non-mechanical thinking when it is accompanied by a wide focus attention. Then that is wide focus attention comes out of silence, slow mind, slow thinking.
Dr. Radhika, you knew J. Krishnamurti personally and have seen him in person. Could you please share with us how Krishnamurti was like as a person? It will be so interesting for us to hear about your experiences.
Well, I think one of the things I should say is that he had a powerful presence. He communicated something, some sense of a sense of lightness of being. So when you were with him for a bit, you came away feeling much lighter, and he communicated that silence, that quietness to the. It was like, I don't know whether you in India, when you got in the summer months, in May, June, when it's very hot, and we are used to going to the hills, to the mountains, and then when the mountain air first strikes you on the cheek, there's a certain coolness. And when you were with him, you felt a certain coolness to the brain.
Wow,
and that,
amazing.
I would like to say, is very, very, and it stays, but it's soon covered over by the noise of daily living. Yeah, that's one thing that was very, very impressive about him. The other thing was that he was quite a hard taskmaster. So the way every gesture of his had a certain, I don't want to gush like a teenager, but he had a certain perfection about it, which also communicated, you felt a certain aesthetic quality.
Yeah.
But accompanying all this was a certain hard taskmaster. He was a hard taskmaster. He wanted you to pay attention. He wanted you to be all there and not fritter away your energy. So he's serious.
Mm-hmm.
So when he talked to children, one more thing, if I may add, when he talked to children in the school, and teachers said, why should the 6-year-olds and 8-year-olds come? Because they don't understand what you're saying. And he would say, no, let them come, let them sit. So there was some extra dimension that communicated apart from the words and the thoughts and the ideas.
Yes, I think he cared about children so much. He knew that it's really important. If you want to teach humanity something, it should start from early age. And could you tell us more about the J. Krishnamurti's foundations and how they came about and their activities, in particular about the significance of education in Krishnamurti's teachings and vision, and how the schools of the foundation implement that vision?
Kamal Bhai, you want to say something about it?
Yes.
Which is very.
So, in fact, thanks to this program, I knew a lot about it, but I had to do a little bit more research. And I was stunned. I was stunned by the fact that that Krishnaji, over a period of 60 years, I think, the words that somebody mentioned, I think it's from a reliable source, some 20 million words and over 75 books. And I think, all the three foundations, the three principal foundations, one is in America, in California, one is in England, that's in Brockwood, and one, of course, is in India. I think they are all doing a fabulous job in terms of preserving the teachings and disseminating them. I think that's the beauty of some of that, that's going on. The way all of that you can see now, because of digital means, they are available everywhere, actually. And the foundations are doing a very good job in preserving it in both in book form as well as digital. I think for schools, I think, Radhikaji would be a better place to talk about that vision that he had for education, because she's been in that throughout her life. And I think she will be able to say even better about.
There are certain values that come from Krishnamurti's teachings. One is love of nature. He had a great feeling for nature. So he felt that the school should inculcate in the child a love of nature. And that requires work on the curriculum also. So in a way, this contemplative mind that one associates with Krishnamurti translates easily into practice. For one thing, he said, you have to examine your relationship to nature, to your fellow human beings, and to share the planet with you, and to ideas. That can be worked out. And it's a pluralist vision of education. So if I'm in Rishi Valley, which is a drought-prone zone, with a past of tremendous poverty, then you have to have a certain attitude, build a certain kind of school that addresses these problems. Because whatever you say, Krishnaji wanted to change the world. He was not just a contemplative. He was a man of action. He wanted his schools to educate children who would grow up to change the world.
He had a great vision, and you're all helping to actualize that vision, which is great. So how about the curriculum of these schools? What is their is it a normal education like the other schools? What is the difference?
Well, in science, we have special emphasis on biology, which from the earliest levels are not only textbook oriented, but look at field work and what is nature in that nature. Look at a pond and see what gives it a certain purity and what keeps the waters pure. So field experience is very important. That's one thing. Say history. You teach history not through pride, because generally the tendency now, when you have hyper-nationalism, is to tell the past through pride. And I think we should learn to translate that value of truth, of looking at things as they are, and record and teach children that the past not always just a sense of pride. There are lots of bad things about the past, and you should learn that, and that continue into the present, because the past is not the past, it's still in the present.
So he was recommending to look at the past and the present and the future with a realistic approach.
And multiple approach.
Wonderful.
Multiple approaches.
I can imagine they are really interesting, these schools, and we need more of them around the world.
Yes. There is evidence of various kinds, evidence to support a point of view, evidence to support the opposite point of view. And children should learn to be able to discriminate, to think through these things.
Well, yes, the art of conversation and conflict management, all the things that are lacking in many schools.
Yes.
Would you like to share the website for our listeners?
Yes. So just to say that, I think I'll just share the three principal websites. So as I mentioned, there are three foundations. And there is one in America, one in England, and one is India. So the one in America is www.kfa.org. The one in England is kfoundation.org. And the one in India is kfionline.org. I'm just mentioning these three because through them, I think you'll get all the websites, all the schools. The other thing, Laila, very briefly, and I just want to say this because, I think talking about the curriculum and teaching, just to give one example, I read about how Krishnaji suggested, for example, that if you're teaching history, it's not just a matter of events, that this happened and that happened. It's like trying to get the child to understand the issues that the human behavior, the greed, the self, the ambition, to try to understand so that they get a feel for the fact that this is what we are, even today, this is what we are. So it's understanding the curriculum, understanding what is being taught, but also understanding the human issues behind those events.
That's really interesting. So he recommended us to use a psychological outlook to look at history.
Just not to look at the event only, but just to look at what human issues prompted those things to happen. Because just to develop an understanding, things haven't changed really. It's the same issues of greed, ambition, all that. And that's what you want to teach us, to go beyond the normal teaching, which is, just to get marks and pass exams.
Yes.
So it's much more than that, basically.
Yes, that's very much needed, that kind of outlook. Well, Dr. Radhika and Mr. Kamal, thank you so much for taking the time and being here with us today. It was an absolute pleasure having you on this podcast.
Same here.
Thank you so much, Laila. It was a pleasure for us too.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. To become more familiar with the teachings of J. Krishnamurti, you can always find many resources online and offline through his foundations and many bookstores around the world. And to know more about Brightshift services, you can visit us at brightshift.co, where we offer online therapy, workshops, and meditation sessions to both individuals and businesses. Thanks for being here, and see you next time.